everybody. I'm Mark Rozelle. I serve as the Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to another in a series of events by the Michael V. Hayden Center here at the Schar School. It's great to see all of you here this evening. Our events are getting more and more full every time we do these in person, but I'm also welcoming over 200 persons who have signed up to watch this program virtually on our YouTube channel in particular. So welcome to everyone out there from, I think, multiple countries and states and continents and the like who've become Hayden Center regulars, watching many of our programs. And for sure, I consider the Hayden Center a jewel of the Schar School and of George Mason University. The quality of these programs is among the best, I think, that you will see anywhere in higher education. And we do this with leading policymakers and thinkers who are committed to addressing the most challenging public policy, security, intelligence issues of the day, away from the often overheated debates and discussions in our national politics, so that we can develop informed understandings of key issues. This is the kind of analysis of key issues that is needed now, I think, more than ever. As those of us who are Hayden Center regulars know, we are nonpartisan, non-ideological. We care about good government, good public policy, wherever it comes from, regardless of party or ideology. And we also care to put on programs that are timely and important given the events in the United States and in the world. So I know many of you, again, are Hayden Center regulars, but for those who are new to these events, the center was founded 6 years ago by the former NSA and CIA director, and now for 12 years, Schar School professor, General Michael V. Hayden, who is here with us in the front row tonight. We are very proud to have you in the Schar School, and thank you for everything you have done for us and for this country for many years. General, thank you. The Hayden Center has been a prominent voice in explaining and demystifying intelligence and security issues. So if you've missed some of our past programs, we have all of them on the Hayden Center website, on the YouTube channel. They're really good. I recommend them all to you. So again, thank you for attending. And I now welcome to the stage the director of the Hayden Center, former director of the White House Situation Room, Larry Pfeiffer.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Really appreciate you coming out. I know everybody's got pretty busy schedules. Mark described what the Hayden Center is for you, so I don't need to belabor that. Tonight's event is being recorded and live streamed in case you were not aware and you have any kind of concerns about that. If you're worried about it, sit behind the cameras. We do put on a lot of events. If you'd like to be amongst the first to know about an event, go to our webpage, haydencenter.gmu.edu. And on the right-hand side, you can sign up for our mailing list, and we will only mail you about events. We don't bother you with, we're not selling anything. From an administrative perspective tonight, we're going to have time for questions. When David indicates it's time to line up at the microphones, we got microphones in both aisles. Line up there, and he'll just call on you alternately. We would ask that you identify yourself if you'd like. If you're a journalist, we'd really love to know you're a journalist and where you're from. And please make please make it a question. If you're going to give a speech, come talk to us afterwards at the reception. We'll take all speeches then. Following the event, we do have a great reception. It's going to be in the multipurpose room. It's going to be in the furthest multipurpose room, so you just need to walk down the hall. It's not the room immediately adjacent. At least that's what they told me. So about tonight. So 2 weeks ago, we did this great event here. We had the current director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Lieutenant General Scott Berrier. He came here. He answered just about any question that Michael had or anybody else in the audience had about world events. One of the questions he got asked was, what keeps you awake at night? And if you go back and watch that recording, you're not going to see anybody say that it was Israel, Palestine, Hamas, a war in the Middle East. I think that is a testament to just how national security works, and it explains to you the struggle and the challenges that intelligence community here in the United States and in those foreign governments face on a daily basis. We'll be talking a lot about that tonight. We've invited this esteemed panel to come and discuss this with you. Moderating tonight, if you don't know them, I'll try to be brief, but David Priess. He's a writer and speaker on national security issues. He has written a great book called The President's Book of Secrets about the President's Daily Brief. He himself was a CIA analyst and served as a briefer of the President's Daily Brief. He's currently Director of Intelligence at a startup firm called Bedrock Learning. He's also co-host of Chatter, a podcast that is put on by lawfare.com that addresses many of the same issues we addressed tonight. He's been a senior fellow here at the Hayden Center for the last few years and a visiting professor at the school. John Brennan, for those who don't know John, he is currently a senior national security and intelligence analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He's been quite busy, and I'm amazed they let him go tonight to come talk to you tonight. But more importantly, or more famously, he was CIA director from 2013 to 2017. He served as the Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to President Obama from 2009 to 2013. He was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center and its predecessor from 2003 to 5. His CIA career is storied, and it includes time in Saudi Arabia, Israel, Palestine. He was and is a student of the Middle East. He knows Arabic. Anybody speak Arabic? You can ask him a question in Arabic, see how he does. And he studied at Fordham University, University of Texas, Austin, and American University of Cairo. Ellen McCarthy is the CEO and board chair for an organization called Truth in Media Cooperative. It's an organization that's rallying forces to fight disinformation here in the country to help better educate and inform young people in particular about what kind of media they can trust and what kind of media they should avoid. But prior to that, she served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research from 2019 to 2021. She was Chief Operating Officer at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency from 2015 to 18. She was the president of an organization that I consider a partner to the Hayden Center, the Intelligence and National Security Alliance, from 2008 to 2012, held a number of senior positions at the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence at the U.S. Coast Guard, and began her career with the U.S. Navy. Michael Morrell, shoring up this side of the stage, is currently a senior counselor at Beacon Global Strategies, which is a risk management consulting firm in Washington, D.C. But more importantly to all of us, they are the host of his now renewed, relaunched podcast, Intelligence Matters. They just launched their first episode last week. Second episode came out today? Tomorrow. So, and both are focused on the same thing we're going to be discussing tonight. So find that wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Michael was Deputy Director of CIA from 2010 to 13 and the Acting Director twice in 2011. And late 2012 to 2013, he was keeping the chair warm for John when John came on board. And in his 30-year career at CIA, he held many senior positions, including Director of Intelligence, Associate Deputy Director. He's well known for having been a briefer to President George W. Bush, was with him on 9/11. So over drinks in the reception, you can ask him what a fun day that was. Author of a wonderful book, The Great War of Our Times, CIA's Fight Against Terrorism from al-Qaeda to ISIS. And he's been a friend of the Hayden Center and the Schar School for the last 5 years. With that, I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Larry. And thanks to all of you for attending virtually or in person. We have a lot of different experiences from different intelligence perspectives here on the stage tonight. So I'm going to do something a little bit different, which is ask the same question of each of you, because you bring those different experiences and can, in a sense, shine light from different perspectives on these thorny problems that we're going to be talking about here. So let's go temporally. Let's start with the past first. When Hamas attacked Israel, it was seconds later, not even minutes later, that you started to hear calls of intelligence failure, or more often catastrophic intelligence failure, or galactic intelligence failure. And that term is loaded. That term includes a lot. That sometimes is people substituting policy failure. But intelligence failure at its root is either a problem of collection, a problem of analysis, or a problem of disseminating analysis, and often a combination of two or more of those three. So I'd like each of your perspective on that. From what you have seen so far, and we'll start with you, Ellen, do you think that this classifies as a classic intelligence failure, and if so, how?
I think if you define intelligence failure as the absence to have warning, to be able to anticipate a disastrous event on the scale that we saw, that if that's your definition, then yes, but, yeah. Or yes and, but there's so much we still, or at least I still don't know. I mean, you actually highlighted, did we have adequate collections? Was there adequate analysis? Was there adequate partners? I think those are all answers that we'll get at some point. I mean, with every intelligence failure, you know, certainly in the US intelligence community, we tend to review, assess, and get better as a result. And so I'm sure there's going to be lots of times to look at what happened here 2 weeks ago. Yeah. But it certainly seems like an intelligence failure. But I would add, could it have been a political failure? Could it have been a failure on the part of the military forces? I mean, I think there's a lot of actors at play here, and I think we're going to have to spend the time making that assessment.
Right. John?
I think any discussion on this very sad subject needs to start off with the strongest condemnation possible of Hamas's horrific terrorist attacks. There is no rationalization, no justification for those attacks. They were horrific, and I think President Biden captured it very eloquently in his remarks. I think it was on October 10th when he referred to it as pure, unadulterated evil, which it was. So I think we want to make sure that that is out there. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody, certainly on this panel, and hopefully everybody in the room. I think, as Ellen alluded to, there's still a lot we don't know, and there's going to be times for those postmortems. There's going to be time to find out exactly what the two organizations responsible for intelligence on Gaza Strip, that's the Shin Bet, the domestic Israeli intelligence agency, and the Israeli Defense Forces military intelligence, what those two organizations knew, did, what they failed to do from the standpoint of intelligence collection, analysis, their interpretation of developments and events, what they shared with policymakers, what they didn't. But when I look at the lack of how ill-prepared the Israeli forces were in the nearby environs of Gaza, like that music festival that was basically left on its own. There was no augmentation of Israeli defense forces there. Just a few miles from the Gaza border, clearly they were caught flat-footed and very ill-prepared. But again, as I think all of us here who have worked on intelligence know, there certainly can be shortcomings on that intelligence front. You assume certain things, you make certain assumptions about what an adversary can or can't do. You rely sometimes on sources, whether they be human sources or technical collection sources, that in fact may have atrophied. And you also do not put the pieces together so that you have an assessment that really can give you a sense of just how much the barometric readings have changed. And so I think we will be finding out a lot, but I think, as Ellen said, I think it certainly appears that from a warning perspective, for whatever reason, whether the intelligence was not there, whether it was not processed, was not disseminated, was not heard, was not elevated, who knows where this will fall. But obviously, there is a lot of reckoning and accountability that needs to be done in terms of why this colossal failure, I'm just going to use that as a not saying an intelligence failure, but a colossal failure to be able to prevent this horrific attack from taking place. I think we're going to find out a lot in the future, but right now it's still, I think, very preliminary to do that.
Of course, it's a failure. I agree 100%. Maybe some context and then some comments, right? The context is it's hard to overstate how good the Israelis are at collecting intelligence. I would argue they're possibly the best intelligence services on the planet, even better than us. They have a smaller footprint to watch.
I disagree.
They're very, very, very good at it. And then the second piece of context is it's hard to overstate the blanket that they put over Gaza in terms of human, SIGINT, and imagery. So what Hamas accomplished here, is really remarkable. And there's two players, right? There's what the Israelis are doing to try to collect, and there's what Hamas is doing to try to prevent that collection. So that context is really important for what is a massive failure here. The other thing I'd say is that this was not only an intelligence failure, but a military operational failure, particularly in the early hours. It took the IDF, sometimes 6, 8, 10 hours to show up at a location that had been attacked. So I think there's going to be two things that get looked at. I think the other important thing to say before I get to my final point is that this discussion of an intelligence failure is much more robust here than it is in Israel. They've admitted it's a failure. We'll deal with it when the fighting is done. There's actually more discussion here than there is in Israel. The last thing I'll say is that I agree 100% with both Ellen and John that we don't know why. And we're not going to know why until they study it. If you look at when we learned that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction, right? When we learned that, it wasn't until 12 to 18 months later that we had figured out why. After a long period of time of debriefing Saddam and after a long period of time of a task force looking at the question of why we failed, did we really understand why we made that mistake? And so it is going to take some time to figure this out.
If it is a failure of collection analysis, that is, right? If they find, here is the report that was given to the political leadership and they simply failed to act on it, well, then that's a different issue. That could be known sooner, right? But if it's a full investigation into the biases, the analytic problems, perhaps the collection problems, that's what you're saying would take quite a long time. Yeah. Okay, so that's the past. Let's move toward the present and talk about what's been happening since the attack and what is presumably going on now from each of your different perspectives and experiences. What kind of intelligence sharing is going on at the highest level at this time? Analytic, operational, strategic, political conversations involving intelligence liaison relationships now that Israel is at war.
Well, I do think that we're our strongest in the face of a crisis, so I'm positive that we are now pivoting to support. The president has articulated that we will do everything we can to support this. So in terms of how the intelligence, certainly on the U.S. side, we are definitely pivoting to provide as much support as we can in terms of collections and analysis. I think this is almost where we're our strongest. So. So there's no question in my mind that certainly within the U.S. we have relooked at and reprioritized collection requirements. We're certainly going through what we knew and what we didn't know. We're looking to see how that was disseminated. Was it actually, did it reach the consumers? What didn't reach consumers? There's no question in my mind that there's been a pivot and we're giving it everything we've got.
Yeah. Historically, we've had what I'll characterize as robust intelligence cooperation with Israel. John, do you think the dial's been turned up to 11 in the last week or so?
Well, the U.S. intelligence community has really not focused on a lot of collection on Gaza. Certainly in the recent past. Hamas is a terrorist organization, yes, but we don't direct a lot of assets there, human, technical, whatever else. So what I would say is that, and the intel relationship between the United States and Israeli intelligence services, almost second to none. It is so deep and extensive in terms of what is being shared. As Ellen pointed out, I think the intelligence community now is going back into its files and to see what information might have been obtained that maybe was not fully processed, that indicates, that shows what role Iran played in this. But I think most what's happening right now is a surge of intelligence collection that the United States is engaging in. By moving the carrier fleet to the Eastern Med, doing other types of things, trying to ensure that we are able to collect whatever intelligence possible, certainly on the U.S. citizens that have been taken hostage, but then also to be able to provide Israel some greater insight to what it is that they need to know about what's going on the northern front in terms of Hezbollah, Iran, what we might know about Hamas leaders and figures and what their plans are, because clearly U.S. national security interests are at great risk now. And so that surge of all different types of technical collection systems, whether you're talking about overhead, whether you're talking about signals intelligence, whether you're talking about human sources, that surge has taken place over the last 10 days. And I know that we are sharing as much as possible through all different channels into the Israeli system. And it's not just the United States, it's others too. You know, the Brits, a lot of our European partners that have close relations with the Israelis as well.
Michael, add?
I think the only thing I would add is that, you know, it's not just about the Gaza. It's about what the Iranians are doing. It's about what the rest of the region is thinking, where they're pushing, what conversations are they having, what are the Chinese doing in the region, what are the Russians doing in the region, right? There's a much bigger collection pie here than just Gaza. You know, John said something really interesting, which I think is really important, which is when something like this happens, one of the most useful things you can do is to go back and read the reporting on that issue for the previous year. Not the analysis that was done, but the raw reporting. Because oftentimes you will see things in that reporting that you didn't see the first time around, not having understood what just happened. And it's not only a looking back exercise, it's more importantly a looking forward exercise, because you might see something in that reporting that will tell you what's going to happen next. So it's very important to do that.
Can I add to the Gaza? I agree on what you're saying, Mike. I do think Gaza, though, is going to be a very interesting point to review. And I think John made that point about sort of what did we know and not know about.
Yeah, I mean,
Gaza.
I'd look at the reporting on you know, Palestinian extremists. Yeah. I'd look at the reporting on Hezbollah. I'd look at all the reporting on Iran, right? All of those interactions. I'd look at all of that.
Looking at Gaza from an open source perspective, I'm seeing now, because I can see this, how hard it is. Because, you know, you just, in terms of those on the ground who are credible and are reporting in a language that we can collect and understand, is proving to be very challenging. You know, from a misinformation, disinformation, it's a huge, you know, target area right now. And then it also begs the question, when you look back, you know, when we do look back and see sort of what did we know and not know in terms of collections in that region, I think it'll be very interesting to see.
Yeah, clearly, Hamas engaged in a very sophisticated deception campaign over the course of many months before this, because they were actually doing different types of training and activities that were, I think, apparent in plain sight, but they were misinterpreted by those. So I think one of the things we can go back in and look at satellite imagery and see whether or not there were certain mock-ups of certain, like, buildings, whatever else, that were not part of the Hamas strikes 10 days ago. A concern I have right now is, with all those thousands of Hamas terrorists who just flowed over the gates of the Gaza fences and walls, how many of them are sleepers now back in Israel? How many of them have been given direction that when this Israeli ground incursion takes place, you carry out your terrorist attacks against school buses, against civilians, whatever else? The extensive planning, the very sophisticated planning that Hamas did, I'm sure it was carried forward, not just the day of the rage and the terrorist attacks, but it's the plans for when Israel would come in. But what else might be outside of Gaza, in the West Bank, in Israel proper, in the region, in Europe, in the United States, whatever else? But the fact that it's clear that Hamas seemed to have planned this over the course of 2 years, it gave them a lot of time to anticipate what the reaction was going to be and how they were going to then take advantage of the post-terrorist attack environment to cause greater havoc and bloodshed.
Let me add to that. So obviously, Israel had a military plan on the shelf to go into Gaza, right? That's what militaries do, they plan. That plan had to assume a certain response on the part of Hamas in Gaza, right? One of the things that the IDF has to do is, given the massive increase in sophistication we saw in planning and in their operational capability in terms of what they did 10 days ago, you now have to rethink that whole plan in light of what are we going to face that we hadn't thought about before. So just on the other side of the border from what John's talking about.
There are a number of issues in doing that come up. John, I'll build most of all on what you said, but it pulls Ellen and Mike on what you said as well. In looking at information to see what could come next, in terms of trying to determine what to do next, we fall prey to possible projection here. Right, is we can't imagine Hamas would have done this without thinking Israel is going to react, and therefore do they have sleeper cells, do they have follow-on attacks prepared, things of this sort. But you can also just go back to 1973 and say, oh, was this more like the idea of, to put it very bluntly, as Sadat did, punch Israel in the nose to let them know they can't take us for granted. We know we're going to get shellacked afterwards, but it changes the strategic calculus enough that something needs to change, and it leads to something down the road like the Camp David Accords. What is the frame we should use for this? Is it Hamas was trying to shock the system and trying to, in a sense, shake Israel, or was it the first in a series of steps that Hamas could be taking given how much more tactically advanced they were than we thought? What are you thinking so far, Ellen, in terms of how we should frame this? And in particular, with your recent expertise, how does misinformation play into this? Because we're seeing a lot of conflicting information out there already just in the last 10 days.
Yeah, I mean, this has really just been the perfect storm in terms of this sort of the misinformation and disinformation piece for, I mean, so many reasons. You know, John mentioned that this was very much a part of their campaign. Was you know, it was sowing, you know, confusion and using social media as a platform to do that. It was a part of the plan, but then also it was just things as simple as how social media companies are run. You know, what are the policies? How do they, you know, are the algorithms actually developed to be able to identify bad content? Are they in a place where they can take content down? And you know, was that a factor in all of this? Because what we're seeing right now is that, you know, that there's not the policies in place, there's not the people in place, and so it's almost we've become these capabilities have become a petri dish for not only bad actors from other countries like Iran and Hamas, but for those who just want to make some money on all of this. And you've just got, you know, just people who are using this as an opportunity to get more hits or raise more money. And so it's, you know, when I say it's the perfect storm, it's not only the perfect storm in terms of Hamas planning, but in terms of sort of what's going on in the media ecosystem right now that just made it so easy to get leveraged. I mean, there's just a lot of other factors that have gone into why this is the perfect storm. But in terms of, you know, is Hamas's intentions to, you know, to carry on in some follow-on fashion, I haven't seen that yet. I think we have to be prepared for it. Clearly, Hamas, I mean, I just don't have access to that sort of information. But what I do know is that it is now so difficult to get to the wheat through the chaff. That, you know, now folks, you know, analysts and journalists who normally would be searching for information that could help, you know, make decisions, now they're spending time debunking bad information. And so it's just taking an incredible amount of time to actually provide information that can be used by policymakers and people.
John, what are your thoughts on how we should be framing this and how susceptible it is to that misinformation piece?
This is such a complex issue that has been made even more complex by recent events, obviously, and it's difficult to talk about this in a short burst and about what Hamas has in mind. And when I think about Palestinian terrorism and extremism, and it can go back to 1948, which is where the Gaza residents, they're all descended from those Palestinians that were pushed out of Israel. And most of the Palestinian terrorism that was taking place in the 70s and 80s, it was the secular Palestinian groups, the PFLP, the GC, the Fatah, others. And over time, those secular groups really lost a lot of traction relative to the growth of the Islamic extremists, which is why Hamas developed in the late 80s. And gradually, it just overwhelmed those Palestinian secular elements. And Hamas, which is the Islamic resistance movement, had a political agenda earlier on as a result of the Palestinian intifadas. But gradually, I think what has happened over the past 5 or 10 years is that militant core of Hamas that has always been dedicated to pushing Israel out to the sea and to kill Jews and Israelis, they became much larger and much more dominant and ascendant. And so that's why you see tens of thousands of Hamas members. And Hamas is a big organization. It does social welfare, it does education, it has, you know, hospitals and other types of things. It's a political organization, and local officials are Hamas. But that core that is run, the Al-Qassam brigades, which is headed by this guy Mohammed Deif, if he's still alive, I don't know. It just took over basically the organization. I don't think that core, those ones that carried out these atrocious, horrific attacks, have any interest in a two-state solution. Not at all. I think they just wanted to kill. And the frenzy and the fanaticism and the depravity that they exhibited, you know, almost put ISIS to shame. And I wonder whether or not how many of them were drugged up, because a lot of the ISIS terrorists, were high when they were doing a lot of these things. So unfortunately, that political movement of Hamas, I think, has been, again, taken over by this core militant terrorist organization group that now has put all the Palestinians in Gaza at tremendous risk. So the problem today is so much more difficult than it was back in after 67 and 73 and the Camp David Accords. There's so much history, and you can't unwind that. And so now you're dealing with the situation that you have an organization like Hamas that, for me, I think is going to be forever illegitimate. To me, I equate it to like the Nazi Party in Germany in World War II. Not all Nazis were killers. It was a big party. But the Nazi brand was forever, trashed. And Hamas, because of the horrific attacks that took place, what comes next, I don't know, but this group that has taken over Hamas, I think, again, they're ready to be martyred. Yeah. And they just want to go down in this blaze of fame, and they want to kill. So how do the Palestinians and the sclerotic Palestinian Authority leadership, how do they somehow, gain some traction despite these horrific events? So I worry about that, and there's so much that is going out now. As I was saying, that on the open source front, it's hard to figure out exactly what's true, and if whether people are just fabricating stuff, making stuff up. This hospital attack that just took place today, it seems as though it was the PIJ, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that at least the reports are there was an errant rocket that came down and killed several hundred that were in the hospital there. Well, Hamas is claiming no, it was an Israeli airstrike that went in there, which is just going to fuel the fires of anger and animosity and hatred. And
with real world effects. I saw one report coming in, maybe it's already been overtaken by events, that King Abdullah said, well, we're not going to meet in Amman now because of the Israeli attack on the hospital. So this disinformation, if it is that, can have real effects. Michael, how are you framing Hamas in this moment, and how do you think we need to watch our own biases and assumptions when we do that?
The history of Palestinian attacks, and even Israeli extremist attacks, tend to peak when actually peace is on the horizon, or peace has just happened. And I think perhaps the biggest part of Hamas's motivation here was to disrupt what was the creation of Israel becoming a normal nation in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. So if you go back 10 years ago, you had quiet security cooperation between Israel and the Sunni Arab nations. And then that turned into the Abraham Accords, open public normalization of relations. Now, this planning seemed to have started before the Saudi-Israel normalization discussions, but slowly Israel was becoming a more and more normal nation. And that is anathema to any group that wants Israel to disappear. It is anathema to Hamas, it is anathema to Hezbollah, and it is anathema to Iran. And so what I think Hamas was trying to do, maybe what John described was a big part of it too, but I think what they were trying to do was to get Israel to respond just the way they're going to respond here, and really, really isolate them again in the Middle East in a way that they were evolving away from.
So now each of your takes on the follow-up to that, which is the Israeli response. What are you seeing so far? And if you could put on your prediction hat, go back to analytic days, you're leading the analysts or you're helping them with the work. What is it that we need to be preparing U.S. policymakers for in terms of what Israel is likely to be doing and what kind of cooperation they're going to be getting and resistance they're going to be getting from other countries in the region? Start with you.
Start with me.
Yeah.
So if I was back in government right now, I mean, I know there's a lot of reviewing, a lot of looking at intelligence requirements. There's a lot of shifting and moving around. But I think, I think so. A lot of it is intelligence response to requirements. Mm-hmm. And so, as we've identified that, Israel has made clear that they are going all in. Mm-hmm. There's, it seems to be there's going to be a ground offensive, and there seems to be a move to eradicate Hamas and clear out Gaza. If I was working at State Department again, I would imagine that the Secretary of State is not only providing support to Israel, but he's also looking at those nations in the Abraham Accords and probably dealing with Saudi, because there will be a move of front to keep that coalition together. And so, what can we do in support of that effort? Michael kind of gets to your point that we're moving so close, to reaching this end state that we've been working for so long, and then it's all been thrown awry. But I'd like to think that State Department certainly is still working to keep that as fresh and as intact as possible.
John?
I think Israel will go into Gaza on the ground with some troops. I think they're using this time to get as much intelligence as they can about where the hostages are, using this time to prepare for what's going to be a very, very bloody battle, building up blood banks, preparing the hospitals and others for the incursion that is going to be, I think, very, very bloody. Their objectives will be to kill the leaders, not Mohammed Daif, this guy Yahya Sinwar, who is the head of Hamas in Gaza, and destroy their arsenals and basically crush their war-making, terrorism-making capability and recover the hostages. How do you do that when you protect civilian life? It's an impossible balance. I wish I was a fly on the wall with Tony Blinken's 7.5-hour meeting with Netanyahu. President Biden is now en route there, and to show strong support to Israel, to let countries in the region know that the United States is firmly with Israel, but also I think it's to have the opportunity to really counsel some restraint on the part of the Israelis in terms of there's going to be more death without question, but not just the adherence to the rules of war, but also to try to do this in a manner that's not going to make the situation worse. How that happens, I don't know. But I do think that it would almost be impossible for the Israelis not to go in now. I'm sure Special Forces are already in there, looking at some of the locations. They're going to bring forces in and, again, try to recover those hostages as best they can. But those hostages, I'm sure, have been spread quite a bit. They're softening up the targets now with a lot of these airstrikes, other things. And that scenario can go any number of ways. I'm so glad that Benny Gantz is part of this war cabinet and I suppose the National Unity Government, because he's a very competent, very capable, and a very rational thinker. And so they're drawing up these plans, and it won't take place while President Biden is there. It's one of the risks that even if it takes place afterward, the United States is going to be very much identified with Israeli actions, not just our munitions, but also the fact that President Biden was out there right on the eve of some type of incursion. Might they decide not to do this large ground forces incursion? I guess it's possible, but I think the pressure is pretty high.
Michael?
Yeah, I think all that is all exactly right. Just for some context, right, to John's points, this is a 5-mile by 25-mile area, one of the most densely populated places on the planet. The fighting, is not going to be building to building. It's going to be closet to closet, room to room. It's going to be tunnel to tunnel. There are going to be many dead IDF. There's going to be many dead Hamas, and there's going to be many, many, many dead civilians. Unfortunately, I don't see how Israel doesn't do it. I know there's an argument for not doing it, but I just don't see that. I'd love to be sitting in the Israeli National Security Cabinet and listening to the debate between Benny Gantz and Netanyahu on how far to go on other fronts, because I think politically, this government is history. As soon as this fighting is over, Netanyahu is out. His legacy is destroyed. The only way to save the legacy is to achieve some sort of permanent peace. So I'm sure there's quite a debate going on about how far to go on other fronts. And I think for the U.S., right, I mean, our hostages are obviously a priority. Minimizing civilian casualties, encouraging Israel to minimize civilian casualties to the extent you can is a priority. And then to stop the spread of the war is probably the biggest priority. to make sure there's not a second front in northern Israel against Hezbollah, to make sure there's not an uprising that Israel crushes in the West Bank, that sends hundreds of thousands of refugees into Jordan and destabilizes Jordan. To make sure the Iranians don't decide to attack shipping in the Gulf or Gulf oil infrastructure, to make sure Shia extremists in Iraq don't attack U.S. forces there and U.S. embassy there. I mean, that is what the U.S. is focused on, all of those things, and that's what the intelligence requirements are.
As we get through the next question, think of your own questions, and you can start to move to the microphones as we answer this round. So you talked about the next steps, and the fact is this may not stop with Gaza, this may not stop with Hamas. How much does intelligence play into that? If you could get into that room with the Israeli war cabinet, with Biden's conversations, Blinken's conversations, is it those pieces of intelligence that point to Iranian awareness of the attack that will be decisive for Israel? Or is it simply a political dynamic where the intelligence is almost outside of the calculation at this point? Ellen, your take first.
Well, as we do a review of was this an intelligence failure, we'll get a sense of was intelligence outside. Mm-hmm. I'd like to think that intelligence is now inside, mm-hmm. And certainly playing a more direct role. And that considerations, what is Iran doing, all the things that my colleagues here have identified are being considered as we're making decisions about next steps. Mm-hmm. So if your question is where is intelligence, I would like to think that they are they're inside right now and that they're actively being considered.
Right on. Yeah, because I can envision a scenario where there are some signs pointing to Iran and Hezbollah either being aware of what's going on at the time it's going on with Hamas, or preparing some kind of similar action to follow on that could be decisive in such a decision. But John, I could also imagine a scenario where there is nothing on that front. That is, there's no smoking gun, and yet Israel still decides to take action against Hezbollah and Iranian targets. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's going to be some accountability as far as Iran is concerned. Iran clearly empowered Hamas to be able to carry out these horrific attacks and lead to the deaths of over 1,000 Israelis, and as well as several dozen U.S. citizens. Even if they were not in on the decision to actually pull the trigger on that day, they empowered that. And I do think that there will be some comeuppance for Iran at some point. But as far as intel, I like to think that intel in the Israeli National Security Council meetings is driving the discussion. It certainly was when we were in government. I mean, every National Security Council meeting, a principals meeting, whatever, it would start out with a rather lengthy discussion about the intelligence. What we know, what we don't know, what can we in fact collect on, what is our assessment, our analysis, whatever. That sets the stage for the policy discussion about what are the options, and it's usually the least worst option that the policymakers get to choose from. And we're the skunks of the party. Michael and I frequently were in the White House Situation Room where we brought bad news, but that was our responsibility. And I'd like to think that the Israelis discussions are leading off with that type of intelligence, so that there's not just going to be an emotional reaction or a political decision made about what to do. They may have their own political imperatives as far as what they feel they need to do with Hezbollah, and there are a lot of people right now in Israel calling for crushing Hezbollah before Hezbollah does to Israel what Hamas did to Israel. In fact, former ambassador Oren has written some pieces about can't wait because Hezbollah has a much bigger, stronger arsenal. Long-range missiles, they can do a lot of damage, but the last thing we want to do is to have this thing spiral out of control and escalate and multi-front. I mean, then boy, all bets are off in terms of what's going to happen. But I think what Israel is doing right now, what the United States is doing right now, is trying to contain and react and deal with the current situation and not extending it at this point.
Michael, what do you see similarly and differently?
So my guess is that Israel will not expand the war. Israel won't take the first shot in a war against Hezbollah or the first shot in a war against Iran. It'll be Hezbollah's decision to make, Iran's decision to make, and in the short term. I do worry about a longer term, a year from now, Israeli reaction not dissimilar to our reaction to 9/11 going into Iraq, right? I could see the Israelis coming to the conclusion in the medium to longer term here that they can simply not coexist with an Iranian revolutionary government and move in one fell swoop to decapitate the Iranian regime and destroy the nuclear program. And of course, if you're in Iran and you're thinking that's a possibility, you're saying, I have to get a nuclear weapon, right, to deter just that. And so there could be the creation of a dynamic here, right, that is completely separate from what's happening and could play out a year from now.
Let's start with questions. Please do state your name if you'd like, or if you are from a media organization, and place your question in the form of a question, and keep it on the topic of intelligence, Israel, Hamas, etc. We'll start on the east side.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Philipp Sandmann. I'm a former journalist from Germany and now a graduate student at Georgetown University, just not too far from here. Thank you for the insightful discussion. A quick question. Prime Minister Netanyahu, Israeli Prime Minister, said, "We didn't start the war, but we will end it." And you just touched upon that topic already. So a simple question, but probably with a complex answer. What does it actually mean for Israel to end the war, and do they have the capabilities to do that? Thank you.
It's a great question for Bibi Netanyahu, as he said it. This is interminable as far as the tension, the conflict. The Gaza battles will increase and then it will subside. What that state is at that point, I don't know. But unfortunately, there have been so many missteps and missed opportunities over the years that does this make a two-state solution more likely or less likely? Well, I think a lot depends on what happens in the coming weeks and months, if not years. And again, no justification at all for what Hamas did. Horrific, awful, strong denunciation of that. But Palestinians have a right to statehood, in my mind. And they have not been given that right over the years. They've made a lot of mistakes, many, many mistakes. So have we, the United States. So have the Israelis. And I wish we could unwind the clock and go back, because it's so much harder now. There's so much water under this bridge. So I don't know what Netanyahu means by that.
Yeah, that's a problem.
And Tom Friedman has a good piece, opinion piece in the New York Times today, where he said he heard that we're going to end this once and for all. And he said that phrase, once and for all, is really, really a bad phrase, because if people think that they can do that, they're not going to be able to do it. And that's why I think Bibi Netanyahu, with his right-wing government, was trying to crush Palestinian statehood aspirations and effectively did it. And I think the Abraham Accords were sending a signal also to the Palestinians and Arab states. The Emiratis and the Bahrainis and Sudanese, they were not a real concern or threat to Israel. It was a commercial and business deal. That's what it was. And the Palestinians got nothing, absolutely nothing. We are where we are.
And the Palestinians were very, very low on their priority list. It was not just the Israelis.
Yeah. All right.
My name is Khalid Al-Sheikh. I am a senior here at the Shar School and a proud Saudi American. So, Director Brennan, if you want to practice your Arabic, I'm your guy. My question is kind of in two parts, but it's one big question. So, to what degree has the Israel-Hamas situation right now affected the, I guess, the effort to normalize relations between my home country of Saudi Arabia and Israel? And if there is, some level of hope going forward, given recent events and so on. I know President Biden recently said in an interview with 60 Minutes that there is hope. So I just wanted to see all three of you and what you think about this.
It's over for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
End of story. And the foreseeable future will be determined by what happens over the next, several weeks to months.
But hope is not a hope
impossible.
Is not
it's impossible for MBS to move forward with what's going to happen in Gaza.
Hope is not a strategy, but boy, I mean, I hope that we keep those lines of communication open.
You may see the Bahrainis and the Sudanese and the Emiratis, in fact, suspending relations as well.
Yes.
And so it could be a step back. I know, and President Biden is always looks hopefully and optimistically at the future, as well he should. He needs to. But I can't see it happening anytime soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Lauren Hobson. I am not a graduate student. I'm an undergrad at George Mason. So there's been a lot of deals being brokered recently in the Middle Eastern region, like with U.S.-Saudi defense compacts, the China brokered Saudi-Iranian deal, just a lot of different, I guess, deals being made recently. Is there any way that Hamas could have perceived this as, a attack towards, Palestinian peoples and taken that as an initiative to strike? And is there any way, I guess, as a result of all of this conflict that has been going on between Hamas and Israel, if there's any way for U.S. officials to go and talk to Hamas leaders, of course, understanding that there's a strong allegiance to our Israeli alliance? So,
I don't see U.S. officials talking to Hamas. It's a terrorist organization. We treat it like a terrorist organization. There's laws against, media organizations reporting on Hamas. So I don't see U.S. officials talking to, negotiating with a terrorist organization.
okay.
Yeah.
The Middle East is very dynamic. It was dynamic even before the Gaza outrage, with, as you point out, deals that were being struck. You have Mohammed bin Salman, MBS in Saudi Arabia, who has his own view about what Saudi Arabia's role in the world should be and is forging these deals. It's very transactional. And I think that's pretty much a hallmark of a lot of the international landscape these days. Transactional, if not unprincipled, which makes it really difficult, I think, to address some of these simmering, long-standing problems if it's simply a transactional world. Because between the Israelis and the Palestinians, neither side is willing to compromise, make concessions. It can't be transactional. It's like, what really is right for the Palestinians and for the Israelis? But the Russians, the Chinese are very active, obviously. I just worry about what's going to happen in the Middle East, because it really can upset a lot of things in a bad way.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, my name's Ken Meyercourt. The countries which don't support our sanctions against Russia comprise 86% of the global population. Do you suppose 86% of the world does not support our policy towards Gaza?
China and India is included in that 86%, so that's a little bit skewed. But
and it's their governments, right? We don't really know what their people think.
So when you say don't support our policy toward Gaza, what is our policy toward Gaza?
Israel has a right to defend itself.
Well, it's hard to argue with that point. Every sovereign state has
Palestinians have a right to defend themselves, and they're much more in need of defense.
I'm sorry?
Palestinians have a right to defend themselves, and they're much more. Don't start the discussion on the rocket attack. It's been going on for 70 years.
No. Israel, as a sovereign state, has a right to defend itself. There was a horrific terrorist campaign perpetrated by Hamas against innocent Israeli civilians. That's where Israel's right now, with all these hostages. As we have talked, I think, quite a bit, Palestinians have rights and have been ignored, but that doesn't mean that Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself. So the question is whether or not the world's population supports. You look at protests across the world. I mean, they're going to have people who are going to have their own sort of sentiments on this. But I'm glad that this administration, I think, has struck the right tone in terms of we're going to support Israel's right to defend itself. At the same time, we're going to do everything possible to prevent the loss of innocent Palestinian life.
Your contempt for the rest of the world is typically American.
All right. Anyone else want to jump?
No, I would just emphasize that it is possible to believe two things at the same time. It is possible to believe that the Palestinians deserve a state, as John said, and it's possible to believe that they've got the raw end of the deal more than anybody else in this whole drama. And it's also possible to believe that what Hamas did was evil, absolute evil, and possible to believe that Israel has a right to defend itself against that evil. Those two things are possible to be held at the same time.
What's the problem?
Let's go to the next question.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next question.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Dillon. I'm currently a graduate student here in the ISEC program at Mason. And my question is regarding the financial intelligence surrounding the attacks by Hamas. So Israeli authorities have so far seized over 100 different accounts on Binance for cryptocurrency transactions linked back to Hamas. And the rumor this morning from a Binance employee was that they've requested records for an additional 200. Do you think that Hamas funded these attacks via crowdfunding like Telegram or social media? Or do you think the financial backing came from a larger entity?
That's what you said, from the what? Or do we think the financial backing came from?
So
Telegram
small
and
donations, right, or large entity.
Cryptocurrency.
You know, the Iranians for a long time have provided, tens of million, up to $100 million a year to Hamas. So that's, one entity providing a large amount of money. That's not just used for weapons. That's, used to govern Gaza, right? So it's used for a lot of things. But that is a large entity providing a large amount of money. I think, one of the things to be discovered is exactly where the money came for this particular operation, and did it come from special places or did it come from the usual sources?
And I think it's highly possible. So we are seeing that there were definitely fake accounts stood up on Telegram and other social media sites. We know that that's a great source of revenue. That posting sensationalist information, getting more subscribers does result in more revenue. Revenue absolutely could have been the incentive there to continue posting mis and disinformation as a means to raise revenue.
Qatar is another big benefactor of Hamas, trying to take care of a lot of the needs of the Palestinian people. A lot of those funds are fungible. And, $10 million, $20 million, $50 million goes a long way in Gaza. And they were able to fabricate their own weapons and explosives and other types of things. So I think it's a combination of some of these large monies that were finding their way into Gaza, but also a lot of donations that, just like al-Qaeda would do that for many, many years in the Gulf, under the guise of trying to help the poor orphans. And a lot of supposed Islamic organizations we used as a cover for terrorist financing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Adam Schultz. I'm a undergraduate student here at the Schar School at Mason. So in recent years, as an outside observer, it seemed as though the U.S. has been moving to disengage itself from the Middle East, especially with the rise of strategic competition with China and recent Russian actions in Europe. So with that in mind, is the U.S. still going to pursue a strategy of disengagement, or will these recent events pull the U.S. back into the Middle East?
I don't know if I would use the word disengagement, but I'll say that certainly, we did shift to this great power competition and into other parts of the world. I think this actually highlights that, looking at this from an intelligence perspective, that the intelligence community can't be everywhere at all times. But I wouldn't say that it was disengagement. It may have been, not a higher priority currently, and I think that's absolutely the case. But I wouldn't call it disengagement. We are, the intelligence community does respond to requirements and priorities and to national security priorities, and we very well could see that there may be a shift back to higher focus on collections and analysis and support to this part of the world. I don't think we're there yet. We haven't seen that yet, but I might just push back a little bit on this concept of disengagement. It's more about priorities and where you put your focus.
Yeah, the demand signal in terms of Russia, Ukraine, China, cyber, supply chains, all of this, the United States has these global responsibilities unlike any other country on the globe. And the Middle East was relatively quiet for a while, and so it didn't have that same draw. And terrorism, because of al-Qaeda and ISIS, what we did to them. And I agree with Ellen. I wouldn't say disengagement. As the horrific dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi by Mohammed bin Salman, and President Biden calling MBS a pariah when he was on the campaign trail, he still went out to Saudi Arabia and did that infamous fist bump, because I think there was recognition that Saudi Arabia plays a big role. And as distasteful as that was to President Biden personally, I believe, he felt that that was important for the United States to be able to engage with Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. So yeah, disengagement is not what I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sarah Hamid. This is my first year at this Shar School. I'm Sudanese American. I actually had a question. It's a lengthy one. So how does the United States navigate its foreign policy objectives in the Middle East, given the concerns that America does give a large military assistance to Israel, which makes up 16% of Israel's military budget, and it includes advanced weaponry, particularly in the context of the recent surprise attacks and deadly retaliatory operations? What measures are implemented to ensure that this support fosters a peaceful resolution rather than escalating tensions and causing high casualties on one side of conflict? And how does the United States align commitment to promoting peace and stability in the region if majority of its funding is towards the Israeli military budget? And does the U.S. bear responsibility for the increased casualties in Palestine due to the financial support to Israel?
That's a Michael question.
Yeah, I mean, I so agree.
Look, I think, if you were sitting in the room with Secretary Blinken and Prime Minister Netanyahu, you would have heard support for Israel, and you would have heard concern about a lot of things that Israel might be thinking about doing. You would have heard arguments for taking particular approaches, taking care of civilians to the extent you can. Right? You would have heard all of the things that you talk about, and we don't determine Israeli policy, but we have influence. And one of the reasons we have influence is because of what we provide them and the support we provide them. And I think we're appropriately using that influence now.
The U.S. has extensive military assistance programs and economic assistance programs to many, many states in the Middle East, Arab states. You look at Egypt, what they're getting on the economic front and the military assistance front, the Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. We've trained, we've equipped their forces. So there's so much that is there, but at the same time, because of the history of 67 and 73, whatever else, Israel was under attack. And so it needed to have that type of support. But the United States has tried to balance our engagement and involvement in the Middle East, and frequently it's not going to be perceived as equitable by any means. It's a tough balance to strike. It really is.
Thank you.
With all due respect, though, I just feel like right now the panel, though, is prioritizing on the Israeli lives rather than the Palestinians. So what do you guys say on that exactly? Because you were saying that Israel was attacked. However, Israel hit back Palestine, but there's a higher casualty and less military funding from Palestine.
I might add that I think the president has been, I think, John, you just were very eloquent in that the president has been so clear on, his focus in preserving, in ensuring that whatever is done, that innocent and civilian lives are protected. Israel has said they're going to try and do that. Unfortunately, the scenario is such that it's going to be so hard to do that right now. If you look at Gaza and how Hamas has engaged with civilians in terms of where they have set up their own sites, it's just an incredibly challenging environment. But I do believe the president is definitely on the side of ensuring that innocent people are not impacted by this. I just don't see how it's going to happen.
We're all deeply affected by the images that we see of the Palestinian people suffering. Young children, innocent civilians that are being killed and injured under Israeli strikes. Do I wish the Israelis weren't targeting as much as they were? Yeah, I do. But Hamas and PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, are raining down rockets still on Ashkelon and other places in Israel. And so Israel is trying to mitigate that ongoing threat and the risk, and Israeli citizens being killed. Not to the number, certainly, that the Palestinians are.
And I would just ask you to think about this difference. Okay? The Israelis do not target civilians. Those civilians are collateral. Now, they accept more collateral than we would militarily. They're not targeting civilians. What Hamas did in Israel was to target civilians. Their fighters had written orders to kill children, to kill women, to attack schools, to go to hospitals, kill everybody you can. The civilians were the targets. That is a very significant difference.
With all due respect, I'm so
Thank you
sorry.
for your questions.
Okay.
We have many other questions. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Given early reporting and Egypt's proximity, what role do you see Egypt playing in possibly the coming fight, as well as the aftermath, I guess is the best word?
Well, they're still trying to open up the Rafah crossing, which is basically the only exit right now. It's on again and off again, trying to allow holders of foreign passports, holders of passports, because Palestinians don't have passports, they have travel documents, holders of passports coming out. But the Egyptians are very worried that there could be some Hamas terrorists among them, and they have a large Palestinian population. They don't want to be the near-term or the longer-term solution to giving Palestinians a home, in Egypt somewhere. But they're going to, I think, maintain the peace treaty with Israel. It's very important, certainly from the standpoint of U.S. relations with Egypt. El-Sisi and the government of Egypt, has relations with Hamas. They're able to be serve as interlocutors there, and the Egyptians and the Qataris and the probably international, the ICRC, the Red Cross, are the ones that I think can have some influence as far as the fate of the hostages. But I don't think there's not going to be a front opened up with the Egyptian army. That's for sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Although there could be bad protests and demonstrations inside of Egypt and Cairo that could be quite troublesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Caden Groffel. I'm undergraduate here at George Mason. This mic's a little bit short for me, but I'll try to make my questions short.
You're too tall for it.
Yeah. So after this conflict, after we see the Israeli and Hamas war eventually come to an end, possibly because of U.S. aid helping Israel, do you suspect we'll see the collapse of Hamas at all, or will Hamas remain a sovereign state in itself? And what should the UN use to kind of fill that void, or UN IGOs used to fill that void that is left if Hamas possibly collapses?
We have not seen much discussion by the Israelis about the day after. If they're successful in decapitating Hamas, degrading it significantly as an organization, who's left to govern Gaza? Do the Israelis stay, or do they leave? Do they occupy, or do they leave? Who governs in that case? Right? I mean, that's a big question. It's a question we didn't ask and answer about Iraq before we went in.
Or Afghanistan.
Or Afghanistan, for that sake, yeah. So I hope that one of the things that we're talking to the Israelis about is just that issue. What happens in Gaza the day after. Hamas doesn't end as an organization here, right? Palestinian rejectionism doesn't end here. In fact, it will be given a new breath of life. Young children who survive this, are going to become extremists. So that doesn't end. As John said, this is a long-term problem here. But I think you ask a very good question.
Thank you.
I appreciated your analogy, Michael, to Nazism, because I'm just trying to think what other terrorist organization has ever been eradicated. I can't think of one, except for maybe Nazism.
I think they have to rename themselves. I mean, Hamas is going to remain a terrorist organization. I mean, it'll probably, have people inside of Gaza, but also outside of Gaza. So it'll be around for a while. Yeah. But I don't think that they're going to be seen or allowed to be a governing authority in Gaza ever again. They have to rebrand themselves, rename themselves, or whatever. You know, there was, in years past, there was some discussion, and Martin Indyk, former U.S. ambassador to Israel, wrote several good papers about 20 years ago about the potential for an international trusteeship in Gaza. I mean, Gaza has no resources, nothing. And the Palestinian Authority, if they're brought in there by Israel, they're going to be tainted by that association with Israel. But is there some different type of, referred to as a paradigm or a framework or whatever, that there can be some international responsibility for Gaza, for the people of Gaza, so that it wouldn't be tainted one way or the other? But there's been a great reluctance to that. But certainly I would think the Arab states, you know, have the financial wherewithal to help out there. But that would be a real big task. And you know, the concept of an international trusteeship system over time, it was one of the things that the United Nations was, you know, hopefully set up to be able to do. But getting that type of multilateral engagement and consensus for something like that is really tough. But when I think of failed states, you know, I was thinking, you know, Yemen or Somalia, others, you know, these really need the help of the international community. And despite what some people think, I do not have contempt for the global community. I believe strongly in, you know, global citizenry. Unfortunately, though, when I was talking before about transactional and unprincipled, you know, policies and government officials, that has been, I think, a real obstacle and inhibitor to doing something that is really going to tap and leverage the resources of the community of nations to help those that are so beset by problems such as Gaza and others.
Yeah, thank you. Back to the West.
Hi, I'm Bardia. I'm an undergraduate at Shar. I'm also a terrorism data analyst at TRAC here at Mason. I had a question regarding the recent committee meeting, and I think it was Chairman McCall that said they have reports that Egypt actually informed Israel that there was something going on with Hamas, while Prime Minister Netanyahu said we completely deny these claims. Do you think there was actually a intelligence mishmash between the two countries, or do you think that an error might have happened on the Israeli side to make sure the information did not reach the correct hands?
It's my understanding that the Egyptians passed along some type of general warning. Something's happening in Gaza. Something's bubbling up. Frequently, we would be the recipients of these, you know, non-specific, very general warnings. You know, we had warnings before 9/11 attacks that al-Qaeda was planning something big against U.S. targets somewhere. We didn't have the day, time, and details of it. And I think that's the case. There's also reports recently that U.S. intelligence had some things also that was raising concerns there. It's a question, lack of specificity, who became aware of it, what was the reaction to it, and did they pursue it or pull those threads? And it seems, again, we talked before about there was a failure, I think, of many dimensions here. So we'll find out more about that, I'm sure, too.
Thank you.
I was hoping to get your observations on social media-enabled influence operations thus far in the conflict. Based on your institutional knowledge, any thoughts on who the actors are, whether they're local actors, if it's third-party states or non-state actors? And then building on that, as we step back, lessons learned heading into 2024, where there's, I think, 55 global elections and over 2 billion people voting. Are there any lessons that we can learn to build safeguards on this issue?
So I'd like to get your name later because I'm going to give you a check, because that was the perfect question. Thank you. The answer is yes and yes. I mean, I think you know, even Hamas was, so mis and disinformation was absolutely a part of their campaign, and not only in terms of what they're doing right now in terms of the messaging and the misinformation they're sharing about what's going on, but also internally within that area in terms of communicating all the wonderful things they're doing, which was to gain public support. So in terms of what can be done next, I think that, you know, a lot of folks say that, well, the media companies are going to need to institute more content management policies. They're going to have to change the algorithms that enable them to catch, you know, bad information more quickly. I mean, it's all the things that have just not happened right now. And quite frankly, I don't believe that's going to happen. And it's just because there's no incentive for the media companies to do this. It's going to take a long time. Managing content is fraught with ethical and political considerations about how do we, what is the impact on free speech? What is the impact on people trying to communicate their perspective on things? So I just don't see that as being I think that's what's going to be discussed, but I don't see that as an outcome that's going to happen in a timely manner. I actually think that we need to start looking at information differently, that we need to start treating information like we treat food, water, other critical infrastructures, and really start looking at it as a critical infrastructure. And I'm not talking about managing the content, I'm talking about the information itself, so that consumers of information, much like you understand how you consume food, what's in your food, that you have a sense of what you're consuming in terms of information. What's the provenance, what is the sourcing of the data, what is the timeliness of the data. You get to choose what information you use to make decisions. But I think it's a choice you should have right now, because I firmly believe that people actually do want access to information that meets just baseline standards. Where did it come from? You can decide how you want to use it. Just like food, you can decide whether you want to eat a Big Mac or organic food, but you get to make that decision. And right now, we're just in this position where it's so hard to get information that meets those standards. And certainly in a timely manner. So I would argue that we need to actually start looking. I think we need to self-organize. It's not just media companies or the technology platforms, but it's academic organizations. And we really need to articulate what we expect when we consume information.
Just for this conflict, any thoughts on the actors' motivations? Like, was it local? Is it third party?
Yes, yes, and yes. I mean, I think that, you have this sort of petri dish where outside actors can absolutely take advantage of sort of our media ecosystem right now. So Iran, China does this right now here in our own country, Russia. In the case of this particular incident, there was no question that Iran and Hamas were taking advantage of the ability to create fake accounts and to pass information that was just frankly not true, sensationalist, because algorithms pick up on sensationalist data. People respond to sensationalist data. So, so I'm answering yes to all of your questions, but it's also been a challenge for those who are trying to communicate accurate information, because it just doesn't get the same, the algorithms are not such that if you're passing fact-based information, they're not getting picked up and disseminated as quickly as that which meets other standards. So, yes.
Thank you. Thanks. We're going to move to our lightning round, so we get all our questions in before the end of our time. So step up.
Thank you. So given the last couple of years with the conflict in Ukraine and our given support to them and the assuming support we're going to give to Israel, how do you believe that Putin and President Xi are leveraging this spread of American assets, and do you think that's going to have a direct impact on a potential impact on a conflict with China and Taiwan and the United States?
Michael, you want to jump on this one first?
So I'd quickly say that I think the impact on what the United States is able to give Ukraine will be minimal. Israel has a very robust domestic defense industry, with the exception of fighter aircraft and parts, and then some parts for Iron Dome and interceptors for Iron Dome. There's very little overlap between what we're going to be giving Israel and what we're going to be giving and what we give to Ukraine. In terms of China-Taiwan, I'd be shocked if Xi chose this moment to go after Taiwan, because I don't believe the Chinese are ready, and I don't believe he thinks he's ready. Take that risk.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sir.
Hi. Marine Corps Congressional Fellow. Touching a little bit more on China, with securing Israel, I guess what's the likelihood of while we're doing that, bringing in maybe one of our pacing threats as China or Russia initiated by like a secondary or tertiary conflict coming from Iran or another state, and how would that affect our involvement, U.S. military forces, if that did happen?
If another front developed, is that what you're asking?
If another front developed by Hezbollah or Iran, and could that bring in China or Russia, and then what would our response be?
Yeah, there's some argument. I guess I'm not as sanguine as Michael is that the support for Israel is not going to affect our support for Ukraine. Maybe on the munitions front it won't, but I think as Congress looks at these aid packages or whatever, I think Putin must be looking at what's going on right now in Israel and Gaza saying, there's a distraction there, and it's the potential that there's going to be a lessening of support from the West for Ukraine because of the problems that Israel's facing, and maybe an expansion of that conflict would even make it more so, and so Ukraine is going to go into the back. But the U.S. has always wanted to be able to fight a two-theater war simultaneously against major concerns. At this point, I don't see the United States getting into a major conflict in the Middle East. Depending on which way it goes, I guess it could. But the United States, U.S. military, and thank you for your service, is the best in the world. And I believe it can tackle issues, whether it be in the East Asia or the Middle East, with our tremendous global footprint and naval, air assets. Again, I'm hoping that scenario is not going to develop. I don't think China wants to, prick at this right now because there's such uncertainty about what could happen. So I just don't think it's in the offing. But I do feel confident that the U.S. military is able to handle whatever contingency is going to come up out there.
And our final question is from our director.
Well, actually, the final question, I want to honor the YouTube audience. We've had some questions from them, and I want to highlight two that I think are somewhat related, and they have to do with Israeli intelligence services. One question centers around the idea that, is this a crisis that perhaps warrants, the question was framed, is it time to have a 6 eyes instead of a 5 eyes? But maybe we could reframe it as to, would this crisis, in your estimation, drive a ratcheting up of the intelligence relationship between us and Israel to something akin to what we have with the traditional Five Eyes country? The second question related to Israeli intelligence was, how unusual do you perceive the fact that the head of Shin Bet actually publicly admitted a failure and took responsibility, and particularly when there has not been a post-mortem done? Could there have been political implications there? And I think the fundamental question, though, was that unusual coming from the Israeli intelligence services?
I'll take the first one. There's three kind of levels to an intelligence liaison relationship. One is the sharing of analytic views and the discussion of your analytic views. The second level is the sharing of collection, your collection, their collection, the passing of it back and forth. And then the third level is actually conducting joint operations together. That's what we do with Israel, all three, right? And we don't do all three with all the Five Eyes. So this is actually a closer relationship than some of the Five Eyes relationships.
Okay.
Totally agree. On the second question, Ronan Bar is a longtime Shin Bet official. He was the head of Shin Bet operations, so he is steeped in security and intelligence matters. He's a real professional, which I think he was, that's why he went out and said, we failed here. The head of Israeli military intelligence, I don't know him, but he was appointed last year. And his background, his name was Aaron Halev, I think, was in logistics and in technology. The IDF, military intelligence, was the one that had, I think, the most capability as far as the collection, as well as on the technical side, certainly, but also on the assessment side, the analytics side. The IDF military analysts are really, really good. But also, one of the things we haven't talked about is this distraction in Israeli politics. Israeli politics and society is riven because of Netanyahu's rightward swing and trying to enact these authoritarian policies and take over the judiciary, whatever else, that the military and security intelligence services were weighing in on. And so did that play at all in these distractions? Don't know. But again, I think Ronan Bar is a professional, and there will be their postmortem, but they focus right now on doing the best they can to never again be surprised, or not to be surprised in terms of what Hamas also might be planning, and Hezbollah too.
Yep. That's it. Want to close us out?
All right, so first I want to thank you, the audience. I think we've got one of the best audiences out there in terms of the caliber of questions, so a round of applause for yourselves first. Secondly, I'd like to thank this great panel. These are great colleagues. I've worked with and for them a number of occasions, and always am amazed to sit and listen to what they have to say. So a round of applause for our panel and our moderator. With that, I'd like to close. We do have the reception again, multipurpose room down the hall. Some folks should direct you down there. Please come and join us for some drinks and some food. We'll be reconvening as a Hayden Center on November 15th. And we're going to go from the sublime to the perhaps ridiculous. We're going to do an event that's going to look at the unidentified anomalous phenomena, or like a lot of people call it, UFOs. It's been a lot in the news in the last several months about this phenomena and what intelligence has or has not to offer on it. We're going to have the head of the Pentagon's AARO office, which is responsible for cataloging and ensuring some truth as we know it, as to what's going on there. And then we're going to have a Washington Post reporter who's done a lot of writing on the subject. So be on the lookout for registration for that and join us. I would ask that you all in the audience exit and give our folks on stage an opportunity to get their mics off, and they can join you in the reception area rather than crowd the stage. Thank you very much.